Hello, and welcome to another episode of Such a Nightmare Conversations About Horror. I am Katherine Troyer, and I am delighted, as always, to be joined by Anthony Tresca.
Well, hey there, hey there.
Ooh, two hey theres. That's exciting.
Two hey there. I spooked myself. I don't know if you...
I did.
Obviously, the listeners couldn't see this, but I, repelled.
Yes, I saw that. In fact, I thought something was, wrong for a moment.
It was a cry for help. It was someone trying to speak through me.
Excellent. Well, good, because this is a podcast where the horrifically nerdy meets the terrifyingly academic. As we explore that fine line between the horrific and the horrible, in this case, Anthony's second hey there. Each episode looks at a specific horror text that is, for better or worse, giving us nightmares.
And we're so thankful that you stuck around even past this horrifying intro, because our discussion today is over 1974's The Texas Chain Saw Massacre. And as horrifying as this film is, it will not compare to that intro.
No, nothing can.
Unfortunately.
Nothing can. We are looking at this film at the suggestion or request of a listener, which is always exciting, which should, again, here's your PSA for the day, to contact us. And if you don't have social media, you can always send us an email. You can let us know not only what you would like to hear us talk about, but also just say, here's where you guys were incredibly wrong. We're down for all of that. But I don't know if we hadn't gotten this recommendation or request if I would have suggested this film for us to watch, because I don't like watching this film.
Yeah, this is not one that I had ever checked out, because although I know that it is incredibly important to the genre, and I knew that it was a very, very influential film that a lot of people really held in high regard, it never personally appealed very much to me. It looked like kind of a generic slasher, even though I know it was completely genre-defying at the time and really set the stage for slashers to come. I prefer a slasher that's just a little bit, it's got another genre on top of it usually, like either a comedy or you put it in a weird location. And this didn't really seem to be doing any of that. But I am glad I watched it for the first time for this podcast.
And I'm super glad that we're talking about this film. So thank you very much for that suggestion. Because the truth is that what makes this film so effective is how difficult it is to watch, right? It is this unrelenting, just devastating. It's disgusting in all the ways it's supposed to be. And you and I've talked before about other films, and I'm thinking particularly of The Exorcist, where we can recognize its place. We can also say that we're not a big fan of it, but then we also had to add that we just didn't think it was a very well-made film, right? Whereas this one, I can say this film needs to be part of the discussion always, and when it comes to horror, because like you said, now we're like, man, well, they had this element of the slasher and this element of the slasher, but it's Texas Chainsaw made those elements that later slashers adapted. So, it's pivotal. And even though it's not something I'm ever going to put on when I'm just feeling the need to watch something for fun, it is a well-made film because it does everything it attempts to do. And that is it's trying to make you feel overwhelmed and disgusted and traumatized. And there's just some beautiful cinematography. It's a tight film. So there's so much that's right about it. It's so right in what it's doing. I just can't connect to it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very, very bleak film. It doesn't give you a lot to really emotionally grab onto. And obviously that's incredibly intentional, to just kind of, this whole film can be read as a critique of many, many different systems. And as we'll we'll discuss it in the scholarship today. This is one of those examples of horror really reflecting the social consciousness and the zeitgeist of what's going on at the time. So I think it's by intent that it is this bleak, but it still doesn't make for exactly a super fun, casual watch.
No, not for me, at least. And I think there are people for whom it is their sort of like go-to comfort horror. And I find that so exciting, the way that like different cups of tea for different folks. I just, and again, what I appreciate about this film is that every time I watch it, so the first time I watched it, I was pretty young, not as young as some people get into horror, but I think we were like 12 or 13, and we were like, this is...
Oh, wow.
Yeah, well, maybe I was a little older, maybe I was like 15 or 16, I don't know, time is meaningless to me, but either way, I was still in high school, I was still young enough that I'm not entirely sure how we rented it, but I just remember being so like grossed out even before we got to the house, right? Like I remember just being grossed out.
Yeah.
Pretty much in those first couple of minutes, but even just like the van, right? Is so claustrophobic. And when the hitchhiker joins, he's just so off, like putting, right? Intentionally so. And I just I remember being like, I'm not sure I really want to watch this. So I think that's actually, we ended it before we even got to the house, because I don't think I saw that the first time around. Yeah. Oh, wow. And so it's just, every time I watch it, right, I just have a better appreciation of what it is and what it's doing for the genre. And that's not something you can say about every film. So let's start with some of the I think we need to start with the scholarship today, right? Like really kind of just get started.
It's particularly because that's where I think a lot of this film works really well. I think the more you think about this movie, the more impressive and interesting it becomes. Because I mean, it is a very heady, for as gory and kind of, I mean, it's obviously an exploitation film, a very good one at that, but it's also incredibly intellectual in a way that not a lot of horror films are always explicitly.
Yes, and I think it's a combination of that, the sort of intellectual angle, as well as the fact that even though this is an exploitation film, and even though there's very little blood, right, and that was more an issue of production value than not, this is a film that has been banned for very, very long periods of time, as probably our listeners know.
25 years.
Yeah, I mean,
in some parts of Europe.
Yeah, I mean, that's an incredible amount of time. And of course, it makes sense considering Germany's history that they're particularly sensitive about what they allow people to watch. But nevertheless, I think it's that combination of the intellectual element with, again, like you said, this sort of exploitation nature that makes it really hard to just dismiss, right? This isn't the campiness of Evil Dead. This is, no. And this isn't a film where you can be like, well, it's pretty much just soft porn that just happens to have some death, right? There's no there's hints about sex, but there's no sex scenes. There's no nudity or anything like that.
The closest that they get to the nudity is that scene with the hook.
Yeah.
And it's mostly just the bare back.
Exactly. Yes.
In that shot, rather than anything explicitly resembling conventional nudity.
Exactly. And so I think that's what makes this film, I think that's what's created such strong reactions. So the place I want to go, because you could open up almost any horror scholarship book that's talking about horror of the 70s, and they're going to have, if not a chapter on Texas Chain Saw, at least several pages devoted to it. So I really could have walked over blindly to my bookcase, grabbed a book, and started discussing what they were talking about. But the person I want to talk about the scholarship that he's looking at, Texas Chain Saw, is Robin Wood. And Robin Wood is a really, really important name in horror film scholarship, as well as just film scholarship in general. So he passed away in 2009, but in his lifetime, he changed the game. So this every time I think about this sounds like so crazy to me that there was ever a before time. But his he wrote a book in 1965 on Hitchcock, and he basically said we need to be examining the works of Alfred Hitchcock much more critically and theoretically, and we need to be doing all of this. And before that, that wasn't happening, right? Like now, there are so many books on Hitchcock and his life and his films, but Wood was really the first to say we need to look at the director, we need to understand what's happening in the legacy, and he was really interested in trends, right? So he very famously said that to study the evolution of a genre is to study the evolution of a national, and then he put in parentheses the word so unconsciousness, right, or consciousness. And so he said, and he's the reason we take horror scholarship seriously, that like we have these films, and if we look at the patterns, what's coming out in 1960s and 1970s horror, we're going to start seeing some really interesting things about America and about how America is understanding itself. And so he devotes a significant amount of time to talk particularly about Texas Chain Saw. So you may hear I don't know if it'll show up on the recording, but I'm going to be flipping through pages. So this is his collected essays and reviews on the horror film. And it's just such a good book, as it's kind of, collected all of his thoughts and feelings. But the sections on Texas Chain Saw, so one of the things that I think is very interesting is he talks about the, quote, hideous parody of domesticity that is in the Texas Chain Saw Massacre. And he says, we have it in a couple of different ways. We have it in the pairing of off of the young couples, right, and the fact we have a brother and sister, but then as is to be expected, we also have the Sawyer family, and he says,
and particularly in that final scene in which they put on Leatherface puts on the costume to dress up as this grotesque version of the housewife.
Yes, and there is a shot in the film where we're seeing things from Sally's perspective, and she's looking down across the table at the Sawyer family, that looks almost identical to Norman Rockwell's 1941 painting, Freedom from Want, right? So Freedom from Want is that painting that you've undoubtedly seen before, where it's the family gathered together for what looks like Thanksgiving or Christmas dinner, right? And they have the turkey and everyone's seated there, and we have the mom and the grandmother and the happy children, and the curtains are beautiful and the house looks nice, right? And it's part of his Freedom series. He has 4 of them. And it is a near copy, right? Just a perverted, twisted copy. And so I think it's really important that we are seeing the American family, just maybe not the American family we want. So he talks about how it's this obscene parody of the traditional family unit and devotion, because we have, everyone's dressed up for dinner, but the dead grandfather, has to drink human blood to come back, or the apparently dead grandfather. And so he talks about that. The part that I find really interesting is he actually devotes a whole reading to it, to Massacre specifically, and he's kind of comparing Texas Chainsaw Massacre with The Omen. And he's saying that what Texas Chainsaw does is it gives us these important aspects we need to consider. He says the first one is the image of the terrible house, which stems from a long tradition in American and Western capitalist culture. And traditionally, it represents an extension or objectification of the personalities of the inhabitants. And he talks about the fact that in Texas, we get 2. We get the house that is, really gone to seed, and that's Sally and Franklin's grandparents' house. Sally remembers being a kid there, and yet it's now, it looks like it's been abandoned for 60, 70 years. Yeah, it's completely dilapidated. So we have to ask ourselves, what would have caused them to abandon this house, right? And we kind of have to understand that, the slaughterhouse closed, and that's where the grandpa worked. And if there's no work, there's no food, traditional sources of food. If there's no food, there's and no money, then there's no house, right? And so he's really interested in this idea of the Sawyer family as, he says, quote, representatives of an exploited and degraded proletariat. And Anthony, I'm going to pause there because I feel like you are much more interested in the proletariat and the sort of capitalist commentary of this film than I am, and then I'll come back to some other things that Wood says.
Yeah. I mean, Wood talks directly about them being victims of industrial capitalism, Leatherface and the family. I mean, with the most obvious place being that they were previously workers of this plant who have now been rendered completely obsolete due to technological advances. And, I mean, just that alone right there gets at the heart of a lot of what I think this film is about. It just inverts the relationship. They have been screwed over by industrial capitalism and put out of a job, and they had been previously been exploited by them and were thus in power, and now they reverse the relationship. Now they are the exploiters who are operating on other humans as if they were animals, just reversing this pattern of industrial capitalism around horrific results and forcing humans to be on the direct receiving end of the exploitative nature of it, which is for a film that is banned in so many countries just for its violence, I think probably maybe what it's really being banned for is the violence in conjunction with some of these other ideas.
Yeah, so the scene where we get to see the slaughterhouse, right, and Hooper actually like takes us amongst the cows, reminded me quite a bit of the Russian 1925 film Strike, right, by Sergei Eisenstein. So Sergei Eisenstein creates this film Strike that's about a strike, right? It's about a group of people who decide to strike, and he makes what cannot at all be seen as anything like, you're not like, I wonder if this is a relationship, right? Like, he makes it so explicitly clear in his images that he is comparing the masses of workers to the animals being slaughtered. And since it's 1925 and Russian, they actually are literally slaughtering the animals on the screen. It's really traumatizing, but like it cuts back and forth between those right through this montage sequence. And this film, Texas Chainsaw, doesn't go as far as Strike did in making that point, but it goes in through that particular imagery. But it gives us that, right? It lets us know, like, should we, are we the people, doing the slaughtering, or are we the people waiting to be slaughtered?
Yeah, I mean, Tobe Hooper does talk about how this is a film about meat.
Yes.
And it just reminds us that, reminding us of that fact that we are doing this to a bunch of farm animals in this cruel, heartless way. Look what happens when you're on the other end of this metaphorical chainsaw slaughtering stick.
Absolutely. And the thing that Wood talks about that I find really interesting is that how much of this film builds this sense of ambivalence towards this family's monstrosity, because like you said, the film, I don't think, tries at all to make us question whether or not we should try cannibalism. So it's definitely like anti-cannibalism, but
for sure.
It also
a very bold, brave stance.
Yeah, something that you don't see a lot, anti-cannibalism stances. But the thing that's interesting is, like you said, we have to remember that this family, it's made explicitly clear that they didn't just wake up one day and say, I don't really want the turkey slices we have in the fridge. Let's go out and see what we can find, right? This is a needs must sort of situation. And there are other things, right? We see that, like, they have a real waste not, want not philosophy where everything gets used again, and that's that's like a real American ideal, right? Like, to like be scrappy and to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and we see all of that. They're artistic in a really gross way, and I think the film makes me disgusted by their home because it looks so dirty and it just looks like it smells so bad in there. But if they, but again, there's a lot of art, right, and thoughts going into that. Again, the family is a family unit. They have dinner every night together as a family, which is, great. So there's this weird ambivalence that I think is very much, like you said, tied to this issue of capitalism.
Yeah. And I guess also related to the tension between genres at play here, and the tension explicitly between the horror and the comedy genre that's at play here, because so much of this film can also be read as, pretty direct parody in some places where it's so outrageous that satire feels too coded.
Yes.
Because it's just more out in the open, like a parody film in places, particularly with like that the dinner scene that you're talking about, where it's the parody of like an American sitcom-y type of family.
It is.
With the gas station father figure, the killer is like this housewife, like we've talked about, and then the hitchhiker is kind of like the youth, the angsty kid.
Yeah, it really is. And, you know, I mean, we even have the patriarchal figure, you know, the sort of like desiccated grandpa is like sitting in his version of the recliner, right? Like, I mean, you're so right. And I'm so glad you talk about that, because you and I have talked about the fact that we really like horror comedy, which this is not.
Yep.
This is not horror comedy in the way that we I think appreciate horror comedy, but this is horror and comedy, right? And Wood talks about this in a couple of things. He actually compares it with a completely delightful non-horror movie, Meet Me in St. Louis, which also has like a family dinner scene and stuff. And he says, but this is a comedy. Texas Chain Saw is a comedy of despair. And I want to read, and this is the last thing that I'm going to read specifically from Wood, but he talks about the fact that, you know, the film's sense of fundamental horror is closely allied to a sense of the fundamentally absurd. The family, after all, only carry to its logical conclusion the basic, though unstated tenet of capitalism, that people have the right to live off of other people. And then he says what's interesting is to watch the way that like as this film has become sort of a cult classic, how audiences engage with this film, because he said he watched it recently, whatever that meant, with half-stoned youth audience who cheered and applauded every one of Leatherface's outrages against the representatives on the screen. And he says it was a terrifying experience because, you know, these people were cheering essentially for the death of their stand-ins, right? Sally and Franklin, and etc. And so he says that this should not be seen as an isolated phenomenon. It expresses with unique force and intensity at least one important aspect of what the horror film has come to signify: the sense of a civilization condemning itself through its popular culture to ultimate disintegration and ambivalently celebrating the fact.
That's so good, by the way. I just want to point out that's very good. That's very lucid prose. That's so good.
So let's read it again, because I also just kind of can't read today, apparently. So this film shows an important aspect of what the horror film has come to signify: the sense of a civilization condemning itself through its popular culture to ultimate disintegration and ambivalently celebrating the fact. Right? So what's interesting is that, you know, I don't think most people who watch this film today are necessarily rooting for Sally, Franklin, Kurt, and the others. I can't remember Jerry and the girl who gets hooked. Most people are rooting, I think, for at least Leatherface, because he's the one that's kind of like touted as the hero of the film in terms of like media, right? And in terms of like the shirts, no one wears a Sally shirt. People wear a Leatherface shirt. And that's really interesting, because if you think about it, this is essentially a home invasion narrative, where the teenagers are invading the home of the Sawyer family, and the Sawyer family are just defending themselves and then making sure that nothing goes to waste. Because like all of the teenagers are like, oh look, there's a house, let's wander on in and see if we can find what we need, right? Like, now admittedly they're not wandering in to like steal money or to like rape people, which is what a lot of home invasion narratives are doing, or saying, but this isn't that far away from that. They want gas. No. And gas is a form of you know, capital.
Of capital. Yeah, absolutely. It really, I hadn't thought about it through the lens of being a home invasion film, but I think that's a fantastic labeling of it. It is in a lot of ways. I mean, you can really see it in modern home invasion narratives, how much this film has shaped it. Like, you can't look at The Strangers without being like, this would not have existed without Texas Chain Saw Massacre. From everything to exactly what you just said, to even that real world element that this film starts with, and so does The Strangers later on, which is, I think the Texas Chainsaw Massacre does that element, the real world element that it tries to pin itself as a real story, a lot better than The Strangers is able to do it later on, or other films who have tried to do it later on, because this one has a very clear and specific reason that makes sense textually and outside of the text even, I think, as to why they are trying to make this seem as if it's a real film.
I think that's such a good point. So, in fact, I want you to elaborate on it. So you say, and I agree, but I want to hear your answer. Yeah. You say that the film, like, makes it so that there's a need for it to be said as this, like, based on a true story. What to you is added to this film by having that layer?
I think it's the sensational nature of the film that gets added to it. I mean, Tobe Hooper talks a ton in interviews about how this is a reaction to the direct lies that were coming from the news and the government at the time, particularly around issues of, like, the Vietnam War. That was the one that he mentioned over and over again. And the sensationalism that was being seen for the first time in newspapers in reporting grisly, violent deaths that were often, as he would mention, not entirely true. Like he mentioned a string of murders that were occurring in San Antonio that were really popularized in the newspaper. And he was like, that is something that he really took inspiration off of. And he was like, I'm just going to lie to people. And that, because that in and of itself is a horror that we experience every single day. And whether the lies themselves are directly true doesn't ultimately matter. It doesn't change the reality that we are all experiencing.
Yeah.
And I think that is why in this film it does make a lot more sense than it does in some other films where it just feels kind of tacked on. Like an element of, like, is this just a reference to this, or do you have a reason independent of that?
And I think that, so the opening narrator, does say, like, this is the story of these characters specifically, and the fact that they're not going to make it and all that good stuff. But there is truth to the part where this is a version of America, an extreme version, right? But that has been brought about by the things that were going on at the time, right? So I think the other reason that I'm okay with that is that I need to be reminded as the viewer, not that, that this actually happened to Sally Franklin, etc., but that, or even that people have resorted to cannibalism as their way to, like, provide food, but the fact that we have created this system of operation where people are told explicitly the way to thrive is to eat, figuratively,
eat each other,
right? I mean, let's look at the number one model that we have today of that, which is Jeff Bezos, who has made it explicitly clear. I read an article recently that was saying that Amazon is going to start using, or has started using, robots to hire and fire people based on an algorithm, right? So it has, and and it's like one of those sort of impossible algorithms. That's certainly a less bloody version of things, but it's still a very, the disenfranchised, the proletariat, being forced to make decisions that nobody is drawing attention to, right? So the news is talking about the desecration of dead bodies, which is terrible and sad and all that stuff. But those bodies are also dead. Nothing's going to happen.
It doesn't talk about speak to the actual harm that is being perpetuated within the system itself.
Exactly. There's no, like, hey, the slaughterhouse closed, right? It completely ignores it.
Yeah. And focuses just on the aftermath of these events without it really does reflect, I think, the shallow nature of how news is portrayed, in which you focus only on the violent end result, but don't dedicate nearly enough time to explaining the reasons why this happened. It's never about that. It's only about what bleeds, because that leads.
Oh, that's lovely. Yeah, and you can see that. I think a really good example of that is the first couple of minutes. So the first couple of minutes are just, they're so gross. But they're gross.
They're really gross.
For a couple of reasons. One of the things that's really interesting about that sequence is that the first sounds that you're hearing of what sounds like, bodies being dug up doesn't match what you're seeing, right? So there's this sort of uncomfortableness because you're experiencing something different with different senses. But then when we start to get to that, iconic sound of the light on the flash going off, right, and we see all these glimpses, I think you're absolutely correct. The only things we get to see are the grotesque after effects, right? We don't get to see the closing of the slaughterhouse and people looking for additional work. We just see the decaying, decrepit, super disgusting bits and pieces left over.
Yeah, and I think in this other real world, the element to it really works because this whole film is really rooted in the fact that it could all happen. It very much feels like this is just something that is right on the edge of happening. This kind of anarchistic manner of living that eventually might have to resort to. It kind of really does feel like that in a really grody, disgusting kind of way.
Yeah, so one of the things that I think this film does with having that sort of really disgusting sort of element of the Sawyer family and their home and all that stuff, that I think can be a problem, and I think has become a problem in horror cinema, is the sort of monsterization of the other, and the others defined as the poor and the rural, right? So, we're supposed to side with the city folk, the clean folk, the very white folk, and even though we're supposed to see that they shouldn't have to be warned, right? If they're told, you don't need to go there, you shouldn't worry about that they have every right to do that, right? We're supposed to kind of read the film that way, I think. If we're supposed to see them as our heroes, right? But I think, and I saw you starting to pause, right? I think one of the great things is that this film, and it's not continued onward. I think that's the problem. This film does create a little bit more ambivalence, right? Because again, if we go to that home invasion element, right, they are told, you don't need to go here. This is not yours.
Don't do this.
You don't need to access this.
The reason why I think it also feels so real and this is just on the edge of happening is technically, particularly in Texas where property laws are strong, everything that the family does to defend their home and their property is legal. Is it morbid and extreme? Yes, but it's not a lot different from a southern guy cocking their gun at you and telling you to get off their property. This is speaking from real world experience. I grew up in East Texas, not Round Rock where this film was set and shot, but I know where Round Rock is.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about you. Not that I was I wonder if Anthony's had to escape Leatherface before. Not quite that far, but I was thinking of you in terms of this film feels so authentically Texan in a lot of ways. Even just the scenery shots. There's something about the Texas sky that is really just, it's wide in a way that not all states have that sort of same expanse. It felt very real. And you're absolutely correct. There's a law that says, you can, if someone breaks onto your property and you harm them, that's one thing. But if they take something, even if they took a pencil, then you have the right to kill them, right? We have laws like that in place. And so what's interesting, and this is, I think, a mistake that other horror films make. So other horror films, Wrong Turn is a good example. And they're on Wrong Turn number 6 or something now.
Lots of wrong turns. You think maybe just by accident, the sheer odds that maybe they would make a right
That's
turn.
Hysterical. That can be your 3-minute horror film where they're should we go left or right? And they're left, and they're right decision, and then the film ends. But films like that are hillbillies, gross, creepy, poor, defenseless, usually teenagers that just made an accidental mistake, whereas this one, the teenagers are aggressively and going places that they're told not to go, and even the rural aspects. So this film in some ways reminds me of films like Winter's Bone, which admittedly is a very different film, right? But it has that same, like, we cannot and should not maybe judge societies within America that we don't understand, right? Like, I never grew up eating roadkill, but I also never had to grow up eating roadkill. Whereas I know people that did, right? Or I know people that ate barbecued squirrel. And to me, I can't do that because I have a rule that I can't eat anything that I want as a pet. And I made the mistake once of trying kangaroo, and it tasted like regret. It was the worst thing ever. So like,
Fair
so I have,
enough,
you know,
yeah.
so that I have that rule, so I can't eat squirrel because of that. But I knew people growing, not growing up, living in Kentucky, that was just part of their family's source of protein, right? And so what's interesting about this film is that, like you said, even though it makes us, again, not root for cannibalism, hopefully, it doesn't judge the Sawyer family to the degree that I think other horror films that are less sophisticated and less ambivalent, and more just sort of black and white end up doing.
I think it's absolutely fitting that you talk about how the Leatherface and family
Right.
are portrayed as being so kind of understandable and sympathetic, because I think it relates back to the metaphor you made earlier about the really rich and the horrific actions that they take, but they're through other means, and they're often not as direct. They're indirect actions that trickle down and affect millions of people indirectly because of the choices they make to further their own wealth, in the case of like Jeff Bezos, to extend that metaphor. But the actions in this, there is no alienation with this family here. They are far more natural and in touch with their roots, and the only reason why we perceive their actions as any more violent than the actions of someone like the ultra-wealth are because of how direct they are. And I think it really gets back to the idea that as a society and as individuals, we're so alienated from these kinds of actual direct ties that when we see them, we immediately are be like, that's so disgusting, that's so horrifying, when in all actuality, it's not any more horrifying or violent than the real world indirect violence that occurs every day. It's just so much more frightening because we like to hide that violence behind other people, other means, technology, etc.
That's such a good point, and that's such an important point, both in terms of the film's narrative on food, right? Because so many of us, most of us don't kill our own food, and most of us, you know, are what makes this film so relevant and timely today is our continued like dependence upon farmers and agricultural, you know, workers, but also are increasingly putting them into the shadows, right? We're like, but we don't actually want to know about how hard it is to be a small farmer. Can we just make sure we have almonds year round? And it's like, well, we can if we like engage in monoculture. Like, you know, there's so much, you're so right that we are increasingly removing ourselves from our agricultural roots that actually kind of help to define our nation, right? And then the other thing is that, as you said, when you talked about violence, right? So as a film that's coming out during the Vietnam War and as a response to the Vietnam War, part of what made that well, there were lots of things made that war very, very problematic. Lots and lots and lots of things. But
so many.
But one of the things that war that distinguishes that war from some of the later wars that we fought as a nation is the intimacy of it, right? You know, when the vets came back, we were so upset because they'd intimately been a part of the killing, right? Like, oh, you killed people up close and personal, but you were around them, you know, and we've begun to remove that, right, through like drone strikes and things that we can do that allow us to be removed from the killing in a way that the Vietnam War was very cognizant that war is killing, right? And so I think you're absolutely correct. That's such an insightful way of reading it. And, you know, the thing that Wood talks about, you know, the sort of parody or absurdity of the family unit. Yes, we are missing the maternal character because all we have is the truly dead grandma. And, you know, yes, there's this way in which, like, Leatherface then becomes this like stand-in for the mother because he's always wearing the apron, like you said. And he's, you know, making the dinner.
that's another really interesting thing about it, that it like acknowledges the fluidity of roles.
Yeah.
And when there's not actual members to fit into that role, then you just reshape your family unit to better fit those roles instead of just embracing your act.
And so I don't want to say like that family is like the most progressive, because that makes it sound like, again, I'm being oddly like in admiration of them. But you're right. We have gender fluidity. The father figure who runs the gas station, you know, there's that scene where he says, I just don't want to be a part of the killing. You know, I understand why we need to do this, but I don't want to be a part of that. And there's, you know, and then the hitchhiker mocks him for it, but like, this character has a clearly defined like understanding of who he is in the system. And even the like, let's have grandpa do it, didn't you say he was the best at the game? You know, I mean, there's even this like respect for elders. There's a really weird way in which the family, even as it's showing us a parody or an absurd form of family, is also telling us that family and the structures we've built are absurd, right? Because you can slip in and out of them. And that's an awful lot to pack into a really short film that's really just about some people being prepared for dinner. Like, that's a lot.
But I think that the simplicity of the story itself, just like five youths, as the actual description. They go into,
which reminds me of
on a trip.
My cousin Vinny. Anytime someone says youths, I always think of So as 5 youths go on a trip.
Five youths. I don't remember the rest of the tagline verbatim, but 5 youths stuck with me. Basically, 5 youths go on a trip and then get killed by Leatherface. It's a very, very simple story. It's everything around it, the ambiance, the editing that really allow it to flourish as a horror film.
And there are 2 other things I think that are worth mentioning. So one thing we haven't really talked about at all, but if you have the internet and enjoy using the internet, I encourage you to just kind of go out there, and that is to read up on like the production of this film. Because God. So Anthony, will you reshare that super gross tidbit that you told me before we started?
Well, due to a lot of like budgetary things in this film being made for a pretty low amount of money, they cut costs in interesting ways. It was, for example, cheaper to get real human bodies from India than it was to get prop skeletons made. So they had real human bodies, real animal skulls and things and carcasses and whatnot all around the set. However, horrifying fact about the making of it, is that the cameras that they were using required 4 times the amount of light that the normal Hollywood cameras did. So that meant that they had to get really in Texas, where it was in the summer, where it was already hot. They had to get super intense industrial lighting and shine them on these carcasses, which heated up the carcasses and the flesh that was still on the bones and made the whole set smell like rotting carcass.
Ugh. And it wasn't even just the sets and the props that smelled. The actress who played Sally, like several of her costumes got stolen, so by the end she was just like wearing that same one that was like by the end of production actually stiff with fake blood. The actor who played the grandpa, who was actually like a teenager, refused to like constantly be put in and out of his makeup, so they had to like do it over like this 30-hour or like some insane period of time. Leatherface couldn't take off his mask unless they got to have breaks that were longer than 15 minutes, and they never had breaks that were longer than 5. So he had to like stay in his mask, and like it smelled. I mean, like everything on this production smelled.
And it was also just bonkers in some of like the director. First of all, Tobe Hooper sounds like a bit of an insane wackadoo, because at least in terms of the dangerous situations that he put the actors in, they used a real chainsaw for half of the shoot, just like with the real blade, and it took the chainsaw coming 3 inches away from the actor who played Kirk face for him to be like, I think someone might get hurt. Maybe we should replace this. Maybe we shouldn't. Maybe we should. So I keep in mind, they just took the clutch part out. It was still the rest of the real chainsaw. So you could still get hurt from it, like, going around. But the blade wouldn't kill you.
Yeah. These low production, like, vision films, and I'm thinking of, like, Evil Dead as well. Of
course.
By the time they, like, got to production, if the masterminds, Sam Raimi, Tobe Hooper, were sane before, they were certainly not sane by the end, right? Like, and they're just, like, it was such an intense, like, cutting corners, thinking about things, and I think that's so fascinating because, again, there's, I think, something to be said about having to have this sense of ingenuity. So that was was one thing I wanted to make sure we talked about. I have to quickly say, every time I watch this film, I hate Franklin a little bit more. Is that fair? Like,
yeah, I think that's a pretty fair assessment. He's a weird guy. He's really. I know he does get put. He's clearly been dealt a pretty bad hand.
What
and,
a
like, he
terrible
gets put in
trip
some
to be on.
weird
Yeah.
situations, and he's right to complain about that. However, what he's not right to do is be such an a-hole about it. Oh my God, these are your friends. Like, dude, take some time. You should have you should have honestly just gone out and take a breather by yourself. Don't stay in that space and yell at everybody else. Yeah. That's not cool, homie.
And he sometimes acts like he's about 12, right? And
yes.
And I actually read somewhere that the actor Paul Partain decided to be. Did you read that he wanted to be so in character that, like, he was just always complaining that everyone was kind of glad when his character died, so that he didn't have to be on set anymore. So and
the director kept that actor away from the rest of the people, along with Leatherface. They kept Leatherface away until the first day that the actor shot with them. But they also kept Franklin separated from the rest of the actors to increase the isolation. See, that's what some of the kind of weird manipulative-y director things that he did on the actors, where I'm like, little sketch, dude, but I guess you got your movie and it's your art.
In the 70s and 80s, right, you could get away with, and 60s, we saw that with Little Shop of Horrors too, right, where he was like, hey children, do you want to make a penny? And they were like, yay. So, the things that you could get away with as filmmakers that now it's just like, let's pretend we didn't do that, is amazing.
Yeah, for all the critiques that I do agree with about the frustrating nature of the civilizing process in America and the alienation that it causes. The civilizing in terms of how we make art is, I would say, good, because it means that less people are getting actually abused and bleeding in the films. Like, they used real blood in some takes just because it was cheaper. Like, real people cut themselves on set so they could use the real blood in the shots.
That is both disgusting because of the just, again, I'm thinking about the smell,
of course.
Just like, that's and they did it. I think that's the part, right? Like, they were like, okay, well, if it's for the art, right? So that's just amazing to me. So the
artist, am I right?
Right. The last thing I want to say, which is fitting, is I just want to talk about the very last, like, minute or so of the film, right, where we have Sally covered in blood sitting in the back of that truck. The sun is coming up, and I think this is really interesting because we have another film that came out in 78, right, and that's Dawn of the Dead, where we have, the end of the film happening as the sun is rising. But what's really interesting about both Dawn of the Dead and Texas Chainsaw is we're left with that final question of, yes, a new day has literally dawned. Yes, they've escaped, but is that such a good thing, right? Because I don't think Sally's coming back from this emotionally. I don't think that this is going to be something where she bounces back. Certainly the Sawyer family isn't bouncing back. And by extension, America, right? Like, small class, the proletariat, right? This new day is not going to be any better because the long dark night has ruined everything, right? And I just think that's what a really intense way to end a film, by not letting us feel comfortable even as we're watching our heroine be rescued and she's literally riding off into the sunrise. It's not happy, it's not good.
I mean, it's only not good for that character if you read them as the heroine.
Right.
And the one who you are supposed to be rooting for, which, as we've discussed at great length, is at least uncertain.
Right.
It's not necessarily that.
Well, and if Leatherface or the Sawyer family, they also, their day has also been ruined, right? Because, you know, we've lost several of them. The families, the home has been invaded. The front door is literally not there anymore. So I like, no matter who we're supposed to see, it's not, the day is not beginning as this, it's not the dawn of a new good moment. It's trauma being carried on into the next day. And that's really a fascinating way to end a film like this.
I think it's also a fascinating way to end this film is with the final iconic shot with the sun rising, this very natural element rising in the background, with Leatherface dancing with the chainsaw, something incredibly technological and man-made, and this kind of juxtaposition that has been set up throughout a majority of the film of the natural versus the technological, the industrial, and we end on these two things being juxtaposed in the same shot and dancing around. It's just a very, very interesting manner to end the film on.
Thank you so much for joining us for our discussion of the Texas Chain Saw Massacre. As you can tell, because this episode's a little bit longer, we had a lot to say. So again, we want to thank our listener who suggested that we talk next about Texas Chain Saw Massacre.
Very good recommendation.
Yeah, it really, I had a great time talking about this film. We're going to shift back, for those of you that are regular listeners, we're shifting back to our discussion and venture into the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. And so our next episode is going to be on
Freddy's Dead, The Final Nightmare.
Excellent. So this is the 6th film in the franchise. We encourage you to listen to any of the other episodes that we have about the first 5 films. Although what's lovely, as we've discussed about the Nightmare franchises, is that you don't really have to know what happened in the previous film to be able to appreciate the newest film. So that's really exciting. Anthony, what else do they need to know from us?
Well, they should definitely check out all of our social medias. That's the best way to get in contact with us, and all of those are in the description of this podcast. Either shoot us a recommendation like one of our listeners did, and that's how we got this episode that you're listening to right now. Let us know what you agree with. Let us know what you don't agree with there as well, or by emailing us, which is also in the description. And feel free to check out the backlog of some of our older episodes.
And then the last thing is that we want to make sure that you have, say it, Anthony,
a spooktacular day.